is the initial trigger in 80% of cases. And depression and PTSD are different diseases, but this is something they share in common, right? It is traumatic stress, like active combat or natural disasters or community violence or sexual assault that causes post-traumatic stress disorder. And not everyone that is exposed to stress develops a mood disorder. And this ability to experience stress and be resilient and bounce back and not develop depression or PTSD is known as stress resilience. And it varies between people. And we have always thought of it as just sort of this passive property, right? It's the absence of susceptibility factors and risk factors for these disorders. But what if it were active? Maybe we could enhance it, sort of akin to putting on armor. We had accidentally discovered the first resilience-enhancing drug. And like I said, we only gave a tiny amount of drug, and it lasted for weeks. And that's not like anything you see with antidepressants, but it is actually kind of similar to what you see in immune vaccines. So in immune vaccines, right, you'll get your shots, and then, weeks, months, years later, when you're actually exposed to bacteria, it's not the vaccine in your body that protects you. It's your own immune system
Hello,
that's
mic
developed
testing, mic
resistance and
testing.
resilience to this bacteria that fights it off. And you actually never get the infection, which is very different from, say, our treatments, right? In that case, you get the infection, you expose the bacteria, you're sick. This is a tuberculosis ward. And at the time this picture was taken in the late 1800s, 1 in 7 of all disease. It was also called consumption. And it was the disorder of poets and artists and intellectuals. And some people actually thought it gave you heightened sensitivity and conferred creative genius. By the 1950s, we instead knew that tuberculosis was caused by a highly contagious bacterial infection, which is slightly less romantic. But that had the upside of us being able to maybe develop drugs to treat it. So doctors had discovered a new drug, iproniazid, that they were optimistic might cure tuberculosis. And they gave it to patients, and patients were elated. They were more social, more energetic. One medical report actually says they were dancing in the halls. And unfortunately, this is not necessarily because they were getting better. A lot of them were still dying. Another medical report describes them as being, quote unquote, inappropriately happy. And that is how the first antidepressant was discovered. So accidental discovery is not uncommon in science, but it requires more than just a happy accident. You have to be able to recognize it for discovery to occur. And as a neuroscientist, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my firsthand experience with whatever you want to call the opposite of dumb luck. I guess let's call it smart luck. But first, a bit of background. Thankfully, since the 1950s, we've developed some other drugs, and we can actually now cure tuberculosis. And at least in the United States, though not necessarily in other countries, we've closed our sanatoriums, and probably most of you are not too worried about TB. But a lot of what was true in the early 1900s about infectious disease, we can say now about psychiatric disorders. We are in the middle of an epidemic of mood disorders like depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. 1 in 4 of all adults in the United States suffers from mental illness. which means that if you haven't experienced personally or someone in your family hasn't, it's still very likely that someone you know has, though they may not talk about it. Depression has actually now surpassed HIV/AIDS, malaria, diabetes, and war as the leading cause of disability worldwide. And also, like tuberculosis in the 1950s, we don't know what causes it. Once it's developed, it's chronic, lasts a lifetime, and there are no known cures. The second antidepressant we discovered, also by accident in the 1950s, from an antihistamine that was making people
Mic
manic.
testing, sound testing,
Imipramine.
sound testing.
And in both the case of the tuberculosis ward and the antihistamine, someone had to be able to recognize that a drug that was designed to do one thing, treat tuberculosis or suppress allergies, could be used to do something very different, treat depression. And this sort of repurposing is actually quite challenging. When doctors first saw this mood-enhancing effect of iproniazid, they didn't really